Welcome back to Cards and Comics. Today I'm going to be talking about why I prefer DC comic book characters and stories more than Marvel. I'm going to also discuss why that is a very unpopular position in the hobby and just generally in the collecting universe, and why is it such a hard thing for people to say nowadays. It's almost like you're ostracized a little bit from the collecting community if you say those things, because I don't think it's always been that way. And generally, most people like to read good stories. And in my opinion, DC Comics has better stories than Marvel Comics. And I'm not the only one who thinks that way, but there's definitely a mob that will shout you down if you do talk about why you think DC has better characters or stories than Marvel. And I'll give you an example before we start, because I'm going to go through sort of my history and why, how I grew into being more of a DC fan, and my history with comic books in general. But a good example I'll say is this: is when I first started coming onto YouTube and watching videos, I watch sports card content and comic book content, and one of the big guys on comic book side is Reggie Collects, and I still think his channel is really good, but I was on one of his videos and I commented that because people he's a big Marvel guy, and someone commented that they like DC, and he says something like, well, why would you prefer DC over Marvel? Or it was that kind of conversation. And I wrote in the comments section that, DC Comics overall have better stories, than Marvel Comics. And what I was talking about was, like, you take the best Marvel stories and the best DC stories, and I think DC by far has the better stories if you stack them all up. By far. And to me, it's not even close. And I think that position is probably radical, but I think facts do kind of back me up in some instances. I'm going to go through that with you too. But I said that, his reaction was, "You're insane. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard." And he actually said that during the video. And I thought that was really odd that he would react that strongly to someone saying DC Comics have better stories, because to me and to other people I grew up with, because I started collecting and reading comics around 85, 86, it was just a given that DC Comics had better stories in general from most people I grew up with. And so if you were to say, like, I really love Spider-Man, but if I wanted to read a compelling story, it's going to be a DC comic book. You would be like, well, okay, that seems like a rational thought, because that is DC had The Watchmen, Kingdom Come, or, at the time Kingdom Come, but The Watchmen. You had later on the Vertical books, coming out in the late '80s with Sandman. You had Doom Patrol, Swamp Thing, Constantine. So you had a lot of very, I call, adult modern books that really changed the industry coming out of DC and its imprints. Whereas Marvel, which had some good, had good content coming out. You had Venom around that same time, starting over at Marvel. But to me, overall, there was so much more good content coming out of DC than Marvel, that I don't think anyone in that time period who grew up reading comics between 85 and, let's say, 92, 93 would have been like, yeah, Marvel's making better stories. I mean, and just in general, look at who won the awards, what writers were getting a lot of praise. You had Grant Morrison, Neil Gaiman. It's just on and on. Garth Ennis. Yeah, Preacher. I mean, it was just this insane amount of good content coming out of DC in that time period. And so I think at that time, no one would have even batted an eye saying, like, I think DC and its imprints are making better content than Marvel. But, it is very controversial to say today. And I'm going to show, my reason why I think that is today is because of the movies. And how, and to me, that's such a red herring in this conversation around comic books. The comic books and movies have really no bearing on each other in terms of quality. Now, meaning that just because the movies aren't good doesn't mean the source material they're based on was good or bad. The Marvel movies, I think are formulaic, but they hit on a lot of beats that are very pleasing to watch. And I do like the Marvel movies better than a lot of DC. But even in that, you still have, to me, I like the Watchmen movie. I like the Christian Bale Batman movies more than most of the Marvel movies in general. So there are still things about DC movies that I like. I think the original Michael Keaton Batman was a very good film. And so Marvel really had nothing like that until the what I call the recent Avengers Marvel universe. But before that, even Superman was much better than anything that was Marvel related on the screen. So it just shows like it can change universes, and different medias can do great and then go back to doing poorly and doing great again. But it doesn't change the fact that that a very large bulk of the best written comic books, to me, still come from the DC universe and not Marvel. That'll, until Marvel writes more better material, they're stacked. It's very heavily stacked in the DC Comics favor in terms of best content. And so I'll walk through that at the end, in terms of like why I believe that and why I'm not the only one who thinks that. But I want to go through my history and like why I am such a big DC fan. I'm going to start here with this comic book here, the 10 Nights of the Beast. Even though it's in 88, around the same time, where I was, in 85, 86, when I was reading Watchmen and, really getting into comics at the time, I was, younger, and I didn't really get all the themes of Watchmen. It wasn't until I was older, when I reread it, that I really understood why it was such a great comic book. Because, the Watchmen doesn't have characters that exist in the DC universe, so it felt very alien to me because I wasn't reading about characters I knew about. And now I really liked this time period. I was a Batman fan. I was a fan of Spider-Man and Justice League International when it started. All that stuff was big. Sandman was really big for me. But this comic book was really what kind of made me stand up a little bit and pay attention. This and the next Batman book I'm going to talk about. But it was the fact that, there was two themes here that just stuck with me to this day. I mean, I remember these pages like they were, I just read them. It was this, the 10 Nights of the Beast is about the KGB beast and going to, he's on a mission to kill the president, whatever, very standard comic book setup. But there's this thing here where he's, setting traps for people to kill. And then he hits this, this line, wire across the road and decapitates someone. I'm just like, as a kid reading this, I'm like, that just like stuck with me like big time. Like, my God, he just decapitated this guy. And, they showed it in the comic book, and it just, really was like, wow, that this isn't like, comic books where, people just, like, because you get remember, I was a kid watching cartoons where G.I. Joe is jumping out of the plane, no one ever really dies. This was really, I'm not say shocking, but it definitely, showed me that there was some stakes in these comic books, right? And the other comic book I'm going to talk about was Death in the Family. And the idea that during Death in the Family that they were actually going to leave it up to people to call in to decide if Joker lives or dies. And the fact, Robin, if Robin lives or dies. But the fact that overwhelmingly, from what I understand, from the tally, everyone voted for him to die. And I think today, if that same thing was done, they would vote for him to live, because at the time, no one ever died. Death in comic books was pretty rare for big characters. And I don't think Jason Todd was a huge fan favorite. So I think a lot of people just wanted to see how DC was going to write off a death. And so, yeah, of course, from a writing perspective, I'm going to be like, yeah, kill him. I want to see how you guys do this. Like, how are you going to kill off this character? And obviously it didn't stick, but he came back later. But it just shows, like, Death in the Family was just different, and it just hit different than what Marvel was doing. And again, Marvel at this time, again, right around the same time period, was doing the Venom and doing good comic books, going into especially with Spider-Man, which I was reading, but it still didn't have the gravity that was going on for DC, and that really stuck with me. And then later on, I went to college, and I remember getting into Doom Patrol, crawling from the wreckage. You got Grant Morrison, and I had read Animal Man, and was reading JLI, and those two things were so different. And that's what I really loved about DC was I felt like you had JLI, which was like the kind of like a sitcom for superheroes. Then you had the Doom Patrol, which is basically just bizarre, fourth wall or cracking, characters. Just things were so different and unique that you just couldn't predict how this was going to go. And I really felt like DC was just on the edge, And then, in college, I got introduced to Sandman, and it just felt like DC Comics could do anything, like they could tell a story about, transsexual people. They could tell stories about, gays and lesbians. They could tell stories about death. They could tell stories about paintings who come to life. I mean, they could go into strange, weird worlds, and everything was there. It's like, they could tell any story, and it seemed like very organic for them. And so, it just felt very modern and unique and new. And Marvel really didn't feel that way when I was reading it. Marvel still felt like the stakes were low, that, like they were a little more, whitewashed at that time, not as gritty and dirty as DC books. And again, I think people have gone on to say, DC did that too much. They made it, too dark and gritty, and got overwhelmingly dark in some cases where it wasn't very fun to read anymore. But that's why JLI was that kind of like different, beacon in the sun type of book for me. And so the reason why I talk about JLI so much is because, my favorite character is Blue Beetle, and the second character that I love is Booster Gold. My first sketch card I ever bought, sitting right here. A guy made it for me, that did some sketch cards, and it's, he titled it Super Buddies, and this is like the first sketch card I ever bought, and just, one of my favorite, things to have. I think I've had that card for, I don't know, like since the early 2000s, 20 years. But it's just like, those are my guys, and they came from JLI, and that was, when I got out of college and I quit kind of reading comics, and I got more, I was still into sports cards, but, you go through a period where you don't really have the means or the ability or time to do this, to be caught up and read that. I went through a big period where I wasn't, really involved in comic books, and I got pulled back in. But one of the things that pulled me back in was I started, going to comic book stores just to kind of hang out, like, while my kids or wife were shopping, I would go into a comic book store and just kind of poke around. And then I remember I was at a comic book store, and this guy said something like, they're killing off Blue Beetle. I'm like, you're killing off Blue Beetle. Like, yeah, like the new DC, there's a new DC story coming out and they're going to kill off Blue Beetle. And I'm like, wow, that sucks. I was a huge Blue Beetle fan, when I was a kid, when I was in high school and college. And the story that, that was going to kill him off was called, Countdown to Infinite Crisis. And for a lot of people, and for me included, it's the greatest, probably, Blue Beetle story ever told. But it ends right here on this panel where Max Lord, shoots him in the head and kills him. And to me, it was such a wasted character for two characters. Obviously, they ruined Max Lord, who was a JLI mainstay, and made him a villain, which I still don't really like. And, they killed Ted Kord, who was a great character. And this story did show, if you did good writing, he was a great asset to the universe, but they had plans to replace him with a different character. Now, all that being said, so that would be, to some folks, the perfect reason to hate the DC universe. Like, you should hate DC Comics because they killed your favorite character, they replaced him with a different character, and they've since gone on to write maybe books that you don't like. Okay, well, that's somewhat true. But it doesn't erase the fact that I was still, when I got back in, there was books like Kingdom Come. There was even books like I don't like as much now as, Identity Crisis, that were still compelling. And so, at the end of the day, like, all of this, still made me love, DC more, because I went back and started reading books I missed out on throughout this time. I missed out on, like Vampire. I missed out on, I didn't read some of the Batman books like Long Halloween, and went back to read them. I got hooked on Fables at the time, which was ongoing. And I went back and read all those books. And I kept going back and reading more and more cool books and things I had missed when I was not really into comics. And the majority, or an overwhelming amount of them, were DC related. And it was just because people were telling me what good stories to read. Here, read this. Read Starman. Go back and read Animal Man in its entirety. Go back and do, it seemed like everything that was being recommended to read was mostly, DC books. Now, I went back and read, some good Marvel books. I remember like Squadron Supreme. I hadn't really read that, and that's a good story. So it's like, there are great, Marvel stories. I'm not saying there aren't, but in general, the ones that I'm just drawn to are the DC Universe stories, and I feel like there's just so many good ones. So when I started thinking about this video, and sort of like why I prefer DC, one thing I want to say is, like, the backlash side of it is that the tolerance for people, and I've talked to, and the reason why I bring it up is because I've talked to like at least 10 or 15 content creators or people in the hobby today, not from 5 or 10 years ago, but today, that are pretty much just Marvel fans, and they don't even recognize that DC is even close to the same quality as Marvel, or that they had better content at some point. It's like there is such a blinder on to what Marvel movies have done to the collective consciousness of comic book collectors and comic book readers. And to me, it's kind of sad, because you've got all these great DC stories that if the sole judge of Marvel versus DC is the movie output, then true, like, you're going to say, like, well, the Marvel is clearly superior, so why should I care about DC? But you're missing out on so much good stuff, right? And some of the most iconic books ever written comes out of the DC canon. That, to me, the fact that, when I look at people who say why they don't like DC or what's wrong with DC, it's always pointing towards the media side of it more than anything else. And then you add in sort of like the recent publishing, which is very divisive between, modern DC, storytelling versus what it was like in that golden age of the mid '80s to mid '90s. And then it is hard, I get that, but there's so much good stuff in there that I think it's throwing kind of the proverbial throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, so what I was going to do originally for this video is compile the best, like the best stories, and kind of explain why these stories are great. And I was going to do that by looking at, like 10 or 15 different lists that exist and say, what's, like if you were to take in, people who, do this for a living, or they publish and they have a presence, so their opinions are a little more weighty. If I went and looked at 10 or 15 all-time great, comic book story list, and rank them, how many of them would be DC, how many of them would be Marvel, and all that. Well, this website did it for me when it was cool. And if you look at the bottom, they talk about the places that they actually got their information from. So you can see they've got NPR, Comic Journal, CBR, BuzzFeed, like Time Magazine, Newsarama, things you've heard of, Wizard. You can say they're not great sources, but they're kind of things that, are places where, these kind of lists, these kind of journalists would publish these kind of things. And so they compiled all this into one list and kind of ranked it based on all these lists combined, which is kind of what I was going to do. And the thing that's crazy is if you go through this list, and again, this is like just compiling everything together and seeing which ones are voted on more often than not, you'll see that, the first 9 books on, or the first 9 stories and books on this list are DC. So the first 9 are DC. And again, you can say, well, you cherry picked it, but I was looking for something that was a compilation of a compilation, because I wanted to see if you got 20 opinions, 30 opinions, what would that look like? And it does, to me, it does validate the fact that a lot of people, now you can say critics suck, or these lists suck. That's great. But there's a lot of people who do think that DC has a majority of the good stories that have been published. And if you look at this list, it's about 40 of the 100 are DC, 35 are Marvel, and then about, the rest are, independent books like Image and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and things like that, right? So like they're so about 40. So you say, well, that's only 5 more. But when you see that the top 9 are dominated, the top of this list, the top 10, 9 out of 10, are DC books. And you go to Dark Knight Returns, you've got Sandman, which is made into a really good TV show. I like the TV show. Watchmen, which again was made into a movie and a TV show that both are great. Kingdom Come. You've got Fables, which should be converted to a movie, but the stupid Once Upon a Time stole their thunder. But again, Fables, which I mentioned before. You got Y the Last Man, which Vertigo, which is a DC imprint. So, was made into a TV show recently. Preacher, TV show. All-Star Superman, I think an animated film. And then number 9 is Saga the Swamp Thing, which again is Alan Moore. So, Alan Moore, which is, like Grant Morrison, Alan Moore wrote for DC. So again, and then number 10 comes in with, the Marvels. So as you walk through here, you got Mouse, Fantastic Four, the Lee Kirby era. So again, Spider-Man down here at 13. So then you see the Marvel books, but this list to me, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you got Bone in there, Year One Batman. I mean, you go through here and you'll see that it's hard to argue with a lot of these books. I mean, I love Astro City. I'm glad it shows on the list because it's the first. I mean, I think the first 5 or 6 arcs of Astro City are as good as anything out there. But going back to DC, it's just there's so many, Killing Joke. It's just like you go down this list. If you haven't read these books, I would just, plead with you guys. If you're a Marvel fan, you've never read these stories, you should go and try to take 2 or 3 of these and just read them, and just see what you think. I do think, Hellblazer, Constantine, it's a great character. Planetary. It is now part of DC. The Long Halloween, which is made into recently a pretty good animated film. So again, the point here is like, I love DC. I collect DC. I collect DC cards. I love the characters. Sandman, Blue Beetle. I have a couple copies of Ted Kord's Origin, which came from a Charlton book. They bought the rights to that character. A lot of things came, to me, very clear when people don't even recognize, in some cases, DC even exist. I remember, Neo did a video on CGC grading Marvel cards, and I thought about that. I'm like, shouldn't he say comic cards? Like, we don't say for sports cards, PSA grades Topps cards as a euphemism for comic book or for sports cards. We don't say they grade Topps cards or Panini cards. We say, PSA grade sports cards, and it could be, any kind of sport, any kind of manufacturer. But with comic cards, it's 100% Marvel cards. That's what everyone thinks. But again, there's a ton of DC cards out there that are very, very nice, and some are expensive. Look up Cryptozoic, Henry Cavill, and Gal Gadot autos if you want to see things bringing thousands of dollars. They do sell pretty good. So, and I kind of was snarky in the comments, and I got a response. Like, does this include DC cards? And yeah, it does. But it's like no one even thinks about DC and the card market, because no one, it's almost like it's Marvel or nothing. And I feel like if that's how everyone's going to treat it, it's Marvel or nothing on cards and movies, and then the comic books then don't matter. I think we're going way far away from what makes the comic books great, which is the stories, which is the things that make the characters great. And to me, Marvel hasn't done as much of it as DC has. And that if you just take the best of the best, it's going to be mostly DC in that top, tip of the spear type content. So yeah, hopefully, if you're, again, looking at get into comic books, or you love Marvel, that you just give DC a chance, read some of the best stuff out there, and really make an opinion that, because you can like both. You don't have to be one or the other. I collect a ton of Spider-Man comic books too. Spider-Gwen, Spider-Man, Venom are part of my collection as well. I don't sit there and say, like, just because I prefer DC, I'm not going to ever buy a Marvel book. But it definitely seems that the Marvel guys are a lot more militant against DC than I think DC is against Marvel. So that's my opinion. So tell me what you guys think. Why do you love Marvel? Why do you love DC? What do you think about the two publishers? Which stories do you prefer? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.